Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here in the Treehouse. Before we start our discussion of this week's entry into the Positive Masculinity playlist, I wanted to tell you to check out the show notes for the list of sources we use in this episode, as well as a list of content warnings. If you'd like to connect with us or share ideas for future episodes, find us on Instagram and Facebook at A Safe Place for Boys, or email us at safeplaceforboys@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and enjoy the show.
Right.
And so I think, what Ralph Macchio's character, I forgot his fucking name.
Daniel LaRusso, the main character of the Karate Kid.
I remembered it when I said Ralph Macchio, but I was like,
what Ralph Macchio, the actor, really wanted to prove in making the Karate Kid is that actually it is real karate and the people on Reddit are just being mean.
Welcome to A Safe Place for Boys, compassionate conversations about masculinity in media.
Ooh,
did I do it?
You did do it. I am your host, Kelcee Sykes. With me, as always, is my bonsai guy, Dr. Spencer Todd Bennington, PhD. I gave up halfway through the name.
Let's
this
try
is
that
what
one
happens
again.
when you don't have confidence in yourself.
All right, well, we got it out. Let's do that again. That sounded good. Welcome to A Safe Place for Boys, compassionate conversations about masculinity in media. I'm here with your host,
Kelcee Sykes, and with me, as always, is my bonsai guy, Dr. Spencer Todd Bennington, PhD. How are you, Spencer?
growing, thriving, surviving, because as my hat says, I am in fact a plant dad. And wouldn't you know it, that I did, my dad, my real life father, taught me how to tend to bonsai trees when I was but a boy.
Wow.
Not even just saying that for the podcast. That's a real thing. We definitely
that sounds like him.
Yeah, it does. We had a load of bonsai trees at one point, and there were many an afternoon where I sat down on the living room floor and tweezed and pruned and tied, and we named them all. Can't remember any names I had for mine, which is kind of sad.
Yeah.
But they did have names.
That's great. Did you give them away as gifts to local single mothers?
No, we gave them back to nature when they inevitably died of blight of some kind. They're like more temperamental than you might think. There was a particular bonsai tree specialist in our community that we had to take them to if they got sick and stuff. I mean, they are just like tiny little trees. They need special little things, I guess. I don't know.
I mean, I think I would have guessed that, but I think it's just because they look so high maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
I know nothing about plants, but I'm like, anything you got to take a pair of tweezers to.
Yeah.
Is more work than I'm willing to do.
I mean, it's sweet, though. You do get to train them and, have them take shape however you want, essentially. But with that power comes great responsibility. You got to know, what the pH balance of the soil is. You got to fertilize those bad boys. You got to, use some combination of little pebbles or mulch or pine needles for different ones to keep them warm in the winter. It's a whole thing. Yeah, it's really fun.
Aww.
It's a good little hobby. They're expensive, too.
Well, that's less good.
Well, just FYI, if you're trying to get into tiny trees,
Yeah, you would think they would be less expensive than big trees, but
Nope.
You'd be wrong.
Yeah.
What are we returning to this week?
We are talking about bonsai trees because today we are diving deep into our analysis of The Karate Kid.
Wow.
Not the crappy one.
Not the crappy one. Which crappy one, you ask? Most of them. No,
Yeah.
that's not true. There's like 2 crappy ones, and the rest of them are sort of fine.
But we are talking about the original.
The original. So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this movie, not just because I think it is sort of, at least in the American imagination, the sort of martial arts movie. It's certainly the one that I remember people talking about when I was younger. This was like my sum total frame of reference for martial arts when I was growing up. But also because I have a martial arts expert here.
That's me.
It seemed prudent to play to your strengths and the things that you have spent the better part of your life researching. So I wanted to start off our conversation in in sort of an intellectual headspace. And I want to talk about the different martial arts philosophies that are at play in this movie, because I think a lot of people can sort of identify on the level of Mr. Miyagi good, Cobra Kai bad, and I think for most people that's probably like fine, but I do think there are more sophisticated things happening in the way that all these various characters sort of come to martial arts and relate to martial arts. And I figured I would start off our conversation by asking you, as both a scholar and a practitioner, sort of how you feel about the different ways that martial arts are presented in this movie. So we'll I have my questions arranged in what I imagine to be a sort of spectrum. I guess you can tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I want to start with Mr. Miyagi, because he is the one doing most of the sort of actual philosophizing?
Mm-hmm.
Is the person articulating a philosophy most often. And what I have been able to glean as a person who doesn't know anything about the specifics of martial arts and karate specifically is that if a dichotomy exists between, like, self-defense and actively attacking people, he seems to be saying you should really only ever be using this as a method of self-defense. Is that fair, or am I totally off base?
Kind of. I mean, what Miyagi tells us is that using karate to fight is the last resort. He doesn't say what you just said, which is that it is only a form of self-defense. And so I'll backtrack a little bit. What I mean there is, like, any martial art can be practiced for any number of different reasons based on who's practicing it and in what context and why and, like, what value they seem to get out of it. And so, like, we think, okay, martial arts, it's fighting. But we have that scene in Karate Kid where Daniel's on the boat and he's balancing on the bow, practicing his blocks. And he says that to Miyagi. Miyagi's like, why do you want to train karate? And he was like, well, so that I can fight and win the tournament. You know, karate's about fighting, right? When am I going to learn to punch? Karate's about fighting. And Miyagi's like, is that what you believe? Is that what you think? And Daniel pauses for a second and then answers again and says, oh, I'm training in karate so that I don't have to fight. That's really powerful, actually, because, like, what he's hinting at is, so far in the movie, Miyagi hasn't been teaching him self-defense, really. He's been teaching him discipline. He's been teaching him mindfulness, sensitivity, balance, openness, these kind of, like, interpersonal skills that do transfer way more into your real life than, like, learning to punch real good or, like, breaking bricks with your foot or something. Mm-hmm. And so, to answer your question, like, yes, the way we see karate embodied and enacted through Daniel's practice is primarily a means of self-defense. People attack him, he defends himself. Even in the tournament, most of the points he scores are counters. He waits for someone else to act, he blocks, moves, and then counterattacks. I like to think of at least 5 different, what we call dimensions of meaning to martial arts. The one that everyone thinks of is self-defense. What can you use this in a fight? Mm-hmm. But what do we mean by a fight? Like, in this movie, we see 2 versions of fighting. We see people ganging up on you and beating you down in the street in the early part of the movie. But then in the second part, we see the All Valley Tournament, which is a sports competition with rules and points and fouls and stuff. So, like, karate, taekwondo, martial arts could be self-defense in a life and death situation, or it could be sport competition, athleticism. It could also just be something that you do for your personal health. A lot of the training that we see Daniel doing is just there to make him stronger or to improve his balance, right? Physically and emotionally improve him. And the emotional part gets more towards what we call transcendent goals. The idea that there's something perhaps philosophical or spiritual even that you can learn through some physical practice. There's the 5th one, which is, like, often underrated. Maybe you don't do martial arts to fight or to compete at all, and you're not really so much concerned about your health or transcending to a higher plane of existence. Some people just do it because it's freaking fun. Like, it's really fun. And so we categorize this as, like, performance. Are you engaging in an embodied performance for the sake of your own joy or to, you know, perform for others and, like, spread that joy and energy? And we see a little bit of those different dimensions played out in this movie. But yeah, to your question, like, Miyagi definitely advocates this like fighting is the last resort mentality, almost to a fault. Like we see him earlier in the movie being so non-confrontational that he spends most of his time alone. He's keenly aware of like what confrontations and fights can do and the kinds of negative consequences that come from small scale conflicts as well as larger scale conflicts like war. And so, yeah, he's not a pacifist, but sort of seems to want to be.
It's interesting that, like, Mr. Miyagi is seen as this sort of, at least in the way I have heard this movie talked about, this, like, perfect embodiment of, you know, whatever the ideal philosophy seems to be, when, like, that isolation that you mentioned is him not being in balance. Like, I think of the conversation when he's giving Daniel the car and he's like, you should go and, like, talk to that girl that you like instead of just sitting around with me all the time, because, like, that is the part where even Miyagi recognizes, like, I'm not living up to part of my own code here because external circumstances have led me to be very isolated, and for whatever reason he has chosen not to try to rebuild that social part of himself, at least until Daniel shows up. So it's interesting that, like, he does have a little bit of that I'm saying one thing and I'm doing another thing. Even as a teacher, he knows what the right thing to say is, but he's recognizing as a person that it is sometimes very hard to do things, you know, quote unquote, the right way in the parlance of the movie, which is like, even Mr. Miyagi isn't always doing what Mr. Miyagi says you're supposed to do.
Right. I was just thinking about Southpaw podcast and Liberation Martial Arts. I've been following them for a while now and really paying attention to what they circulate on social media, and they try to teach us deeply entrenched martial artists and martial arts teachers about pedagogy, like how to teach martial arts and some of the pitfalls. And we see them kind of break down in this movie because it's easy to look at Cobra Kai and say, oh, this is reactionary martial arts. They're training just to fight. They're trying to create little weird soldier boys and like convincing them that actually the world is out to get them and the only way to respond to the world is violently. And that's horrible. We see how awful that can be. Like it creates a little gang out of these blonde Nazi boys or whatever. Like, you know, it's gross. But if you're paying attention to like what liberation martial arts is advocating for, then one of the tenets is that there should never really be this top-down hierarchy of the master that knows everything, trying to impart wisdom on the students who need to be totally open. And so a huge red flag for me watching the movie this time was hearing Miyagi all but say that to Daniel when they started training together. He goes, you can be on the left side of the road, safe. Right side of the road, safe. But if you're in the middle, splat, right? You can get hit by a car. Karate is the same way, he tells him. And then he follows it up by saying, I promise, you know, a sacred vow to be your teacher, to teach. You need to promise a sacred vow to be a student, to learn. No questions. Boom, big red flag.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's how you get into the like cult of Cobra Kai as well. Like you follow this like master as if they're infallible without questioning them, without thinking critically about what they're teaching and how it could be applied differently or how different audiences might need to embody it differently to make sense for them. And so I love these moments in the film where we see Miyagi sort of like realize his own hypocrisy. And by the end, I think we do see that he is learning from Daniel as well. That in fact, Miyagi is taking steps to come out of this like trauma-induced asceticism and try to make connections with people again. Like, you know, because he realizes that is a part of his own finding balance. And so, yeah, shout out to LMA, Southpaw Podcast, if you want to learn more about non-toxic martial arts pedagogy. That's why I do like Miyagi takes all of like 5 seconds when Daniel gets jumped by 5 dudes and then asks him like, oh, okay, if you think it's a good idea for me to go talk to their sensei, would you please come with me? Because obviously, like, they won't hesitate to just beat my ass again.
Yeah.
And Miyagi's like, no, I couldn't possibly get involved. And then Daniel's like, oh, great. Thanks.
Cool.
Really great. Really.
None of this means anything then if I'm still just going to get my ass kicked anyway.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And then before he goes, he's like, Daniel? okay, I guess I'll go.
It's like literally 15 seconds of deliberation.
Yeah. And so like that's a great example of like one way that Daniel openly challenges Miyagi to rethink some of his own sort of biases and philosophy, because having ethics and morality is wonderful in a vacuum. But when real life happens and you're like, karate really shouldn't be used offensively, until you see someone like almost get murdered and you're like, I just shouldn't. I'm not supposed to do this though. And it's like, okay, you're just going to let someone die. You're going to let someone get really hurt. Like what are you? I don't know.
Yeah. So, if this isn't a good enough situation to intervene, what is?
Right.
Like, just say you don't intervene at all at that point. So the person who I think is leaning a little bit more towards taking that active role in the world using this knowledge he has gained is Daniel. Obviously, like, he wants to learn a martial art because a thing is happening to him. Specifically, people who know karate are using it to hurt him. And so we've already got a bit of a challenge to Miyagi's philosophy just in Daniel's lived experience, where he's like, okay, but other people aren't choosing nonviolence. So what am I supposed to do?
Right.
And so he's kind of in the middle in that way. But just to appease the 12 million Reddit commenters who you find their reactions first when you search this movie, is Daniel like even doing karate?
My best answer to this is there are multiple dimensions of meaning for what it means to do or embody a martial art. So yes, absolutely, Daniel is doing karate. I think why they're asking that has more to do with like the fight choreography in this movie. Yeah, it looks awkward and silly. Ralph Macchio is like doing silly things, and especially in the tournament scene, he's like hopping around and should definitely be getting kicked in the face or whatever. But like, he's not, and it's fun. And it's especially silly because there are some like legitimate martial artists that have cameos in this film that like, if you see any good fight choreography, it's because of them. Like when you see that compared against what Ralph Macchio is doing, you're like, well, I guess it's karate. I don't know.
Yeah. If you tell me it's karate, I believe that it's karate. It might not look like the kind of karate you learn in your dojo, but...
Well, and like, again, to harken back to last episode, karate is a blanket term. To be more specific, Daniel is learning Miyagi-Do, the way of the Miyagi family, the way they teach the art of the empty hand. There are countless styles named for people and regions and various philosophies that make up the umbrella of karate, the same way that there are for Chinese martial arts or kung fu. Even taekwondo, right? There's just branches of these things. But my real answer to this is like, Daniel is doing karate from the moment that Mr. Miyagi asks him to close his eyes and prune the bonsai tree. Because to do karate, to do a martial art, again, it depends on what you're looking for, and it also depends on how your teacher is teaching you. And so I think that first real interaction with Miyagi is Daniel's first attempt at developing what a lot of people would just call mindfulness, but that's kind of a loaded term, and some people just sort of think it's BS. But what we see in that scene is Miyagi trying to get Daniel to focus on a single thing. So he closes his eyes. He asks him to imagine a tree, like see a picture of a bonsai tree, and only focus on that bonsai tree. Focus on your breath and the bonsai tree. Open your eyes and prune the tree, right? That way he's no longer worried about doing it correctly or incorrectly, right? That binary doesn't really exist. Instead, what we see is Daniel cultivating a kind of sensitivity, I think is a better word used to describe this idea of mindfulness here. And so this is the sort of beginning of a Buddhist philosophy playing out in this film, cultivating this sensitivity, this mindfulness that will follow him throughout the film and lead toward a sense of tranquility. Shout out to Wayne Wong. He's a friend that I've made through the Martial Arts Studies Conference over the past couple of years, and I really, really enjoy his work. So I'm going to be talking about his ideas here as it applies to Karate Kid. And so, yeah, he's definitely doing karate. Like, it doesn't matter, like, what the physical skills look like. If he's embodying these philosophies that serve as the underpinning of karate it's having a transformational effect on his life. Oh, and by the way, he wins the freaking All Valley Karate Tournament.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think he's doing karate.
Yeah, by the metrics set in this movie, he is definitely doing karate, because if he wasn't, somebody at that tournament would have been like, well, hey, now that's not karate.
Right.
Stop doing that.
So some other scenes that I wanted to call out here. I mentioned Buddhism, mindfulness, sensitivity. Once Daniel begins his quote-unquote karate proper training with Mr. Miyagi, when he's, sanding the floor and waxing the cars and all of this stuff, we see these recurring images of circles, right? Big circle, small circle, left circle, right circle, breathe in, breathe out. And so, like, we're no longer in the realm of, like, Buddhist mindfulness, Buddhist sensitivity, and instead we're approaching Taoism, the idea of fluidity that Bruce Lee was so famously, known for quoting Lao Tzu,
Be water, my friends.
Be water, my friend. You put water in the cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in the teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow and water can crash. Be water, my friends. And this is all basically a synopsis from ideas in the Tao Te Ching, where everything in the universe can be seen as a harmonious balancing of opposing forces. So if you're familiar with like the yin-yang symbol, or the Korean flag in my martial art, these are all representations of Taoist cosmology. Anybody, any I Ching fans out there?
Got any big I Ching heads in the house?
But yeah, so like we see these circles coming up, and more importantly, what we see transforming in Daniel is he comes into this training with a bias of what he thinks karate is. Mm-hmm. He's taken a few classes at the Y. He's got books. He's learned to kick. He knows how to say hi-ya and kick a door. Right? So like he is the stand-in for Westerners that have been exposed to like the kung fu craze, movies and media, and he thinks he knows what karate is. But Miyagi is here to say like, well, what I learned from my dad, and I'm going to share that with you. That's the most authentic thing that I have to share with you. And to do that, you have to empty your mind, right? You have to empty yourself first of these biases and these holdups. And we see that in the scene where Daniel challenges him, and he's like, man, when am I going to learn some freaking karate, Miyagi? And
that was a spot-on Ralph Macchio impression.
Thanks, appreciate it. But yeah, he like, that's the sort of like Coen moment, if you will. Not Coen Brothers. K-O-A-N. But anyway, these are like Buddhist ideas, so I'm kind of mixing my philosophies here. But the idea, it's, have you ever heard these questions of like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You're given a nice. Good. You're given a question to ponder and meditate on until you hit this moment of enlightenment. And we see that with Daniel when he's like, why are you asking me to do all these freaking chores, man? I got a tournament coming up. And then somehow, miraculously, he realizes, oh my gosh, I can block all of these punches and strikes and kicks that Miyagi's throwing at me. That's wild. I guess I have been learning something. But most importantly, he's been learning that he didn't know anything. He thought he knew something, but he needed to unlearn to learn. And the other big recurring theme that we see here is this idea of balance, right? And so we've talked about sensitivity, we've talked about fluidity. Those are important parts of balance. But in Chinese philosophy that gets extended to Japanese and Korean martial arts as well, one of the huge cornerstones is Confucianism and the idea of Ren being this like cultural ethic that you can develop, but a better translation might just be humaneness. And again, shout out to Wayne Wong. He included a Confucius quote that I really liked. Humaneness is being human. And so we see Miyagi, after Daniel learns how to block and paint the fence and stuff, takes him to the beach. And he's like, go get in the water until you're neck deep to learn balance. And this idea of balance at first is physical. It's like you need to stand up in the water. You need to stand on the boat. But then balance becomes more metaphorical. As we've mentioned, like he realizes that karate isn't about fighting. It's about finding a balance in your social life. And then once Daniel gets the car, Miyagi tells him that your driver's license doesn't replace your senses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your sensitivity to the world, and go find balance by repairing your relationships with these people who you have wronged or ignored or, been a turd to, basically.
Going to golf and stuff is also karate.
Yeah. The beginning of their training is Miyagi recognizing, okay, here's this kid with a black eye who's trying to do some kicks in his living room. This is an at-risk youth. This is a kid that without some guidance will just be a thug or try to exact vengeance on people or will seek out external validation in all the wrong ways. And so that idea of humaneness, I think, is what triggers Miyagi to even spend more time with Daniel, because the first couple of months they're just hanging out trimming bonsai trees, like in his little closet tree shop or whatever.
Just office, I guess.
Office, yeah. So I think, again, that first step of like recognizing a person who needs some sort of like social, ethical, philosophical grounding, and then recognizing that, okay, well, maybe this practice of karate in all of its forms is something that I can use to help him achieve that. But first, he has to be fluid. He has to, rid himself of these biases. Then he has to learn to be sensitive to new ideas and to the people around him. Only then can he find that balance in himself and with the people in his community. And be the best around!
How do you think that this sort of holistic approach that he's learning from Mr. Miyagi, does it square for you with this desire that he voices, after he is injured at the tournament and he's in like the locker room and they're saying like, well, you're probably not going to be able to go on. And he says something along the lines of like, I can't give up now. I haven't like proven myself to these people yet. Is that like antithetical to this idea of balance, or does that still square with the philosophy that he's been learning through the rest of the movie?
This one's really tough, because if I were his coach in that room, I'd be like, nah, champ, you're done. Like,
yeah, you're about to die, dude.
This isn't cool. Like, you don't risk your health with a permanent injury against a psychopath, because like odds are, even if you beat them, I don't think in real life like that's gonna miraculously.
I think that makes real life Johnny Lawrence even more angry.
Probably. So in this movie, it's easy to read that scene as a little bit of hubris, right? He's like, no, but I have to do this. I'm nothing if I don't do it. I'm too good to fail here, to give up.
Well, I mean, I feel like what he specifically says is, if I don't beat Johnny, nothing change it. Like, I will basically have done all of this for nothing. If Johnny wins, then he knows forever that he beat me and he can keep beating me.
I don't think he says he needs to beat Johnny. So he gets hurt in the semifinals and hasn't gone out to face Johnny. So, but I think in that scene, what we see is Daniel LaRusso saying, all right, I've come really far, but none of that means anything unless I face Johnny. Like, sure. I think the big thing for him is he needs to at least go out there, especially when he's like obviously injured and like Cobra Kai thinks they, put him in a body bag and all that. Like, I think that actually does say more to the bully and these kinds of people, that you're willing to show your face. Like, I don't think it really matters to him if he wins. I mean, it does, but like, I don't think narratively it matters. It just matters that he is able to go back out there. And so like, you could read this scene as like hubris, Western sort of lens, like, oh, he just wants to win. I don't think that's it. I think like what he's picking up on is he's finally realized the quote unquote rules of this new community, and that he loses by not showing up. Like, but if he can appear, right, he can save face. He's sensitive now to the fact that just by standing in the ring with Johnny, making it to the finals, and giving it all that he can give, that might be enough to clue these guys into like, okay, we can't just pick on him and get away with it and not expect any repercussions. Like, this guy is not a chump. It does kind of square. Again, like, he's gotten to this point where he can recognize and be sensitive to how these bullies and the other people in his life would respond to this. And
I mean, the movie doesn't explicitly say it, so this is me kind of reading between the lines, but I think specifically he has sort of figured out how Johnny Lawrence functions. Because we talked about last time in that beach scene where, like, Johnny shows up and he's, you know, picking on Allie and he's breaking her stuff, and he gets into a fight with Daniel, like, on site, basically, without having any kind of questions asked first. And he only sort of stops when he can sense that the group has sort of turned against him. And even, like, when they go to Cobra Kai to first be like, hey, can you tell your students to stop trying to kill my friend here? What John Kreese says is, like, if you don't show up to the tournament, then it will be open season on you. Right. Saying that, like, the expectation is that Daniel will keep doing what he's been doing, like, at school, which is running away anytime he sees Johnny coming. So I think at the tournament, what Daniel is thinking is, like, I don't even know that I can beat him.
Right.
I'm definitely hurt. But the outcome that they wanted, they didn't want to beat me either. They thought beating me was a foregone conclusion. None of this is about who wins or loses. They expected me to not show up.
Right.
And if I walk away now, then it's open season.
Right.
Like, it will then get worse because I've confirmed there were stereotypes. And also, this is my best opportunity to show, we talked last time, everybody on Earth came to this karate tournament for children. Like, everyone in town is here. If I can go out there and say, look at the kind of person Johnny Lawrence is, look at what his coach is telling him to do. I've already had one of his friends basically start weeping after hurting me because he was threatened into doing it by his coach. I know now that the coach is the real bad guy. If I can get Johnny Lawrence in front of a crowd and make him, like, have to pick on me because that's what he is trained to do. That's the type of karate Johnny Lawrence knows how to do.
Exactly.
I can show everyone all at once and hopefully show him what kind of person he is being, because Johnny, I don't know that I think he's like a true psychopath, like the put him in a body bag guy.
He's not.
I think he is a person who is looking for somebody to stop him. He's the mask.
Yeah.
He's like a person who kind of has a sense that he is out of control, but he is so susceptible to peer pressure and so susceptible to this, like, idea of his own ego that he needs a big enough impetus to stop, or he's not going to be able to do it himself. And I think that's what he gets in this final scene is, like, self-awareness that not only is Daniel maybe not quite as easy a target, but also, like, God, what am I doing?
Right.
Like, this kid is hurt. If I win this, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. No, I think back to the scene where Daniel tells Allie just very quickly, like, no, why would you give him the radio? It doesn't belong to him. And we see that moment where her eyes light up and she thinks differently. So Daniel knows he has the ability to help people see the world from a different perspective. With Allie, it can happen verbally, conversationally. That's the literal language she speaks. With Johnny, the language he speaks is physical. And I think to your point, again, he doesn't have to beat him, but just by going out there, even if there wasn't a huge crowd, I think Johnny seeing his karate, whatever karate means to him and to John Kreese, opposed against Daniel's and Miyagi's karate would have him question things that he had never questioned before, going back to this idea of, like, you don't question sensei. You just do what he says.
Yes.
And what I do know about Johnny, again, from the Cobra Kai franchise, is he's very much looking for a father figure. His father is all but absent, and John Kreese has filled that role for him. And so it even doubles down on the idea of, like, not questioning this authority. This is really magnified by the fact that he does lose. When he loses, he is forced to ask the question, well, why did my karate lose? Why did what I learned from my master lose against this pipsqueak?
Despite the fact that, like, on paper, it looks like Daniel is being like, no, I need to fight. Fighting is the solution to my problem. It's not really the fight. It's, I I need to, A, stand up for myself. Like, this is still self-defense.
Right.
For me to walk out of this room and say, like, I'm going to give it a shot.
Mm-hmm.
Even if he gets physically hurt in the process, and he is already physically hurt, that is still a way of saying, like, in the long run, this will be better.
Yeah.
It will prevent more violence down the line.
Right.
And also, maybe Johnny will at least leave me alone, and maybe leave a lot more people than just me alone if he realized, like, I've forced him to face the fact that he is a bully.
Yeah, and Miyagi tells Daniel earlier, there are no bad students. They're just bad teachers.
Yeah.
And so, again, pointing out the fact that Daniel has had this teaching role. He's helped Allie realize something from a different perspective. He helped his own teacher, Miyagi, realize, his own perspective. Even that little scene with his mom when he was like, you didn't ask me what I wanted when we moved out here. And she apologizes. So, like, Daniel should believe that he has the ability to change Johnny's mind somehow.
Do you think there is a difference between that mentality that Daniel is showing in that last scene and the, like, places in the world that market themselves as being like, we'll teach your kid to be bully-proof? Setting aside the fact that, like, this is the 21st century and most bullying is not happening in the same way that it was in the 1980s.
Yeah, I mean, like, I do always kind of snicker when I see that. We saw it a lot in Florida, and they'd just be on the corner of major intersections and say things like, bully-proof your child, call karate, 1-800-KARATE.
Bully-proof your child.
Yeah, and like,
they never mean, make sure your child does not become a bully. That is never what that sign means.
That's the big problem, right? So, like,
yeah.
The implication is, okay, we're going to teach them karate so they can stand up for themselves. In the best meaning, it's like, we're going to teach them things like confidence and to be self-assured and to, like, be someone who a bully wouldn't want to pick on. In the worst possible case, it means we're going to teach them to kick a bully's ass.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh God, really? Yeah, that's such a great point, Kelcee. They don't seem to ever imply, like, we're going to help train young people to be more peaceful and not, like, engage in violent or, inappropriate behavior and instigate fights, whether it be verbal, physical, or anything else. Like, yeah, it's always, again, this reactionary approach, right? This top-down sort of, like, I'm a master, and, like, if you pay me enough money, I can for sure have your kid not get picked on. Yeah,
your kid will be so strong, they will be able to fight off anyone who messes with them, not, I will teach your kid, like, important life lessons and physical conditioning and strength and balance to the point that they do not feel the need to pick on their classmates anymore. They will have self-confidence and not feel the need to be cruel. That's never... It's also my, like... my problem with the sort of cottage industry of the female self-defense class, where it's like, where is the equivalent for men where you teach them how to control themselves in public? Like, why am I the one who has to become a karate master in order to go to the grocery store?
Yeah, no, for real. And I guess the other reason I bristle is just like, you're just saying this because you think it's the best way to get people to pay you for your service.
Right, exactly.
And, like,
there's no proof that this is a thing that, even if that were the thing you were promising, that's even true.
Yeah, it's, like, probably good marketing. But other than that, I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate it. So, like, yeah, I guess the big difference is, first of all, Miyagi doesn't get paid.
That's true. Well, he does get a lot of free labor out of Daniel. Let's be clear. His backyard looks great.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't really get paid. And the other thing is, like, again, what we were talking about before, what he's teaching Daniel is, like, how to be a social person, like, how to deal with conflicts peacefully, how to, like, recognize and be sensitive to the fact that there are things wrong in his life that he has the power to affect. Yeah, so I just can't see that phrase bully-proof with anything but cynicism, unfortunately. Like, honestly, I think that would be a sign outside of the Cobra Kai dojo. Like, bully-proof your child. Sensei John Kreese will teach him to take no guff.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Except from you, of course.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. So that transitions very nicely into, philosophically, perhaps the most extreme is the Cobra Kai dojo. I mean, we maybe don't need to talk super at length about the specifics of their philosophy because they say it out loud constantly. they think that if someone is your enemy, quote unquote, you should kill them.
Strike first, strike hard, no mercy.
Yeah, that's what they believe. How hyperbolic a depiction is that? Is that something that you see in real life?
I wish I could say it were hyperbolic, that it's just like, oh wow, these are clearly villain-coded villains in this movie. No, yeah, so in real life, the worst kind of like reactionary martial arts facilities do look like this, and they frequently have political agendas, wouldn't you know it?
Yeah, shocking.
So we'll share a link to a Guardian article from 2018 that uses the phrase fascist fight clubs to describe these like mixed martial arts gyms that are really incubators for alt-right extremists who learn martial arts to go to protests and be counter-protesters and just absolutely beat the crap out of, people protesting for gay rights, trans rights, Black Lives Matter, you name it. These people showed up at the Unite the Right rally and incited violence. They're showing up now in the UK in the wake of the stabbings in Southport. Like, yeah, these people unfortunately are all around the world, and they're being fed a toxic, hyper-masculine, extremely violent agenda that really appeals to, again, this kind of like bully-proof mentality, but for adults. These sort of like, well, no one loves me, and like, if only men could just be men again, and like, oh, if only I just beat the crap out of all of these libtards, oh, that would solve it.
Yeah,
it's gross. Like,
there is a certain type of person who thinks being bullied looks like people of different races having jobs.
Right.
Women having jobs, gay people being allowed to exist in public, people from other countries moving to their countries.
Yeah.
That's the other thing about these sort of schools. When they say make your kid bully proof, they don't always mean some kids trying to steal their lunch money. They might just mean like, I don't know, there are black people in your neighborhood now. Make your kid bully proof.
Right.
And they let you sort of fill in the blanks.
Yeah. No, really. And like, that's a big reason why that bully proof or any of that sort of marketing is a huge red flag for me, because I'm like, okay, taking it back to Cobra Kai, when you say enemy.
Yeah. Who is an enemy?
Who's the enemy? Oh, this Italian-American guy that just showed up who lives in the poor side of town and goes to your school now and is trying to talk to your ex-girlfriend? Enemy? Ah, okay.
Interesting.
Huh. Yeah. So, yeah, unfortunately, these philosophies do play out in real-life martial arts spaces, and they're gross and they're awful, and if you want to read more about them, we've got some stuff to share for you. But yeah, this is an ongoing problem of people taking a martial practice and infusing it with violent, racist, fascist rhetoric and encouraging these people that would ordinarily just be stay-at-home troll keyboard warriors to come out and play, essentially. And it's really dangerous. So I'm thankful that there are organizations out there like Alex Channon's Love Fighting Hate Violence, Georgia Very's Conscious Combat Club. I've already mentioned Southpaw Podcast and Liberation Martial Arts. My own research and affiliation with Rhetorical Roundhouse. All of that is meant to stand against these violent exploitations of martial arts. But, it's, as John Kreese would say, it's a war out there, kids. And like, in some ways, it is.
Yeah, there are certainly upsides of martial arts having these very flexible boundaries and being sort of open to interpretations and changing as they're taken up in different parts of the world by different people. But that means you can't stop the people whose goal it is to do harm from saying, well, no, this is real karate. What we're doing over here, what they're doing over there is wrong. That's bad. It's not real karate. Come do our real karate so that you can, I don't know, threaten your neighbors and coworkers, because that's what it's for, of course, and everyone knows it. And it's hard to shut all of that stuff down, especially if like that's what somebody encounters first. That's what's implanted in their head as what this practice is supposed to look like. And it's very hard to overcome that initial impression.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls of this movie, but thankfully, this is the movie that sort of like created the American pop culture identity of what karate is and what martial arts is, because it does have an overwhelmingly positive message, even if it sort of misses the mark in a few areas. But we'll talk about that.
All right. So my last question in this area is so silly. This is the question I wrote first, just because I think it's a funny way to distill this conversation. So is this supposedly unblockable crane kick more noble than quote unquote sweeping the leg?
I don't know, man. Like, so like sweeping the leg is what John Kreese asks Johnny to do after Daniel is already hurt by an illegal kick to the knee. And so he's basically saying, like, I want you to do something that's technically within the rules to hurt this person and target an area of theirs that's weak and already hurt, which very much lines up with the Cobra Kai philosophy. No mercy, right? Find their weak point and attack it. The crane kick, is it more noble? Like, when I think about this question, I think about Barney Stinson's character on How I Met Your Mother.
Oh my goodness.
And the reason I bring that up is because, like, obviously the joke in that show is that he has miswatched Karate Kid and he thinks that Johnny Lawrence is the main character, and he lost due to, quote, an illegal kick to the face by that villain Ralph Macchio. And, like, it had me questioning, like, okay, well, when I watched this tournament, I cannot tell you what is legal and what's not based on the goofball things that they're allowed to do and like when they get a foul and when they don't. So like maybe in this tournament, the crane kick, like kicking directly to the face like that, is an illegal move, but it was scored legally. So I don't know. I mean, take it up with the judges, I guess.
Yeah.
The fact that Mr. Miyagi says when done correctly, there is no defense. Like, okay, it's a jumping front kick, buddy. Like you can just move. Like you don't.
What if I take a step backwards?
What if I move to the side?
Spoiled your plan.
And so I don't know about all that. Like there's a little bit of the mysticism injected there. Is it more noble? Like if they're both illegal in the terms of the tournament, then they're both illegal. Or if the crane kick is technically illegal, then it's like less noble, right? Because Johnny doesn't get called out for sweeping the leg. It's just that the audience reacts poorly because they know what he's doing. So, meh? I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think, as with everything else we've been talking about, context is everything. I think, like, a supposedly unblockable kick sounds like a really bad thing to exist in the world. It doesn't exist. You could block a crane kick. You could get away from it. It's not that dangerous. But, like, if the idea is that, like, if a person achieves perfect balance, they can do a move that will hit every time, I'm like, let's never let anyone achieve perfect balance then. There should never be an unstoppable kickmaster just roaming the streets of Reseda. That's very dangerous. Why would we want that? Whereas, like, sweeping the leg in the context of this movie we think is a bad thing, but also, like, in competitions, your goal is often to figure out what the weakness of the other person is and exploit it.
Right.
That's like
within the rules of the game, right?
Right, exactly. Like athletes watch recordings of other teams playing to be like, well, they're not very good at this, so we're going to do that a lot. Either one of these two things can be used to do great physical harm to other people, but like so can theoretically all martial arts.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
A lot of things that aren't martial arts. Like it's all about like the attitude of how you use them and who you choose to use them against. And
I think what's important about the crane kick in this movie is Daniel didn't actually learn it. He only observed Miyagi practicing it in that one scene at the beach. And then it comes up at the end because, and this is where the choreography needed to be better, like the idea is that his one hurt leg can't really hold much weight. And so I think what was supposed to happen with this crane kick is what he was supposed to jump, kick, and land all on one foot. But that's really hard to do.
yeah.
So it didn't really look like that. He sort of lands and stumbles on the one leg and then hops back onto the other leg. But I think like in that perfect world, it's meant to symbolize that like there is always a way, even when your plan or like what you want to happen, it doesn't seem to be attainable. Like, this comes back to the like Taoism of it all, and like emptying your mind and being fluid and adapting to the circumstances. And so in this circumstance, he's got one good leg. And so what better to do with it than this like mystical unblockable kick, right? And in another way, it's like projecting this sense of mystique. Like, why is he adopting this very strange stance? What does he hope to do with just one leg? It's like taking the biases of Cobra Kai and turning them on their head. And that really is the moral victory there, of saying like, you thought you were attacking my weakness. You thought I was weak, but what you thought of weakness was actually my strength. Mm-hmm. And so like, that's all beautiful and stuff, but it does just still look silly.
Yeah, no way around that. So speaking of Cobra Kai and their various philosophies, I want to talk about our problem child. I would like to talk about Johnny Lawrence. We joked when we were talking about that first scene when we're first introduced to Johnny on the beach that he is sort of speedrunning toxic masculinity. What do we mean when we say that? What kind of behaviors do we see in Johnny that stand out as pretty obvious red flags?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much a joke, right? He, after one breath saying that he's turning over a new leaf, no, I don't want to drink, I'm going to really focus on my senior year and all of that, he sees a girl that he used to date.
He thinks they're still dating.
Right. And so he confronts her, inserts himself in a place where presumably he wasn't invited to this beach party, demands that she talk to him. When she doesn't, he touches her stuff, turns off the radio. When she says, no, I don't want to talk, he says, well, I do. And, turns the radio off again, asserting that what he wants is more important than whatever she wants. Mm-hmm. So he's already denying consent and putting his feelings and desires above someone else's. And then very quickly it goes from just touching her stuff to taking her stuff. So sort of like making this transactional kind of argument of like, well, if you don't give me what I want, I will take something of yours. And at first it's like an object, it's a radio, which is like, okay, well, that's maybe not that big of a deal, but it's symbolic of something greater, which is that he's willing to take things, whether it be time, objects, or body, in the worst case scenario, right? Willing to do violence in one way or another to get what he wants. Or if someone, denies him something that he thinks he's deserved.
The see people as an enemy first sort of thing. Like, that's clearly how he interacts with Daniel, for example. Right. They just start punching each other and kicking each other on sight a lot of the time. But do you think that philosophy informs these other aspects, particularly how he deals with Allie? Because, I don't think he thinks of Allie as an enemy necessarily. Like, what he thinks he's doing is trying to get back together with her. But do you think that the Cobra Kai philosophy is informing how he's dealing with her as well?
It has to be. The old adage of, to the man with a hammer, everything is a nail. Mm-hmm. If these are the tools in his tool bag, strike first, strike hard, no mercy, then yeah, we can read his approach as that. He initiates the conversation, and when he's told no, he keeps going. That's striking hard. And when it doesn't seem to go his way, he pulls out all the stops to make sure that he gets what he wants. No mercy. And he's willing to show people publicly that he will take your stuff, smash your stuff, beat up some foreign invader from the faraway land of New Jersey. I think he has a limited set of tools when it comes to dealing with conflict. To him, conflict is fighting. It is adversarial. Mm-hmm. And so when he's in this interpersonal conflict with a person who he thinks he loves, he really just has to fall back on these very limited, often violent tendencies to resolve it. And it doesn't work out for our poor Johnny too well.
Yeah.
Because Allie's not having that. Allie thinks it's all complete hogwash.
her personality is such that she kind of pushes those buttons for him. She does kind of get like, oh, you think you're such a big, strong man? Mm-hmm. And like, oh, if you want to hit somebody, why don't you come and hit me? Mm-hmm. Which I kind of said last time, I think like, ooh, I mean, it's like great that you're standing up for yourself, but like he'll do it.
Yeah, he might.
Is the thing. Like that's always, if you see someone who you know you have conflict with and they are like making eye contact with you while they break something, mm-hmm. It's not just the radio that they're thinking about in that moment. It's very scary to me that those things can kind of bleed into each other, especially if you do, you know, somebody like John Kreese gets a hold of somebody like Johnny Lawrence, who is already raised in this culture of just taken for granted male entitlement. Mm-hmm. And you know, we see it very briefly with Allie's parents, but there is this idea in, you know, at least this subset of a community that these two are raised in, that like women exist to serve you. Like mm-hmm. her dad gets mad at her mom publicly because like their porch has a loose brick on it, and like that's enough of an affront to him that he will like publicly humiliate her in front of a stranger.
I thought I told you to have that fixed.
Yeah. And so it's a really dangerous combination, those two things.
Later in the movie, we get Daniel, who learns not punching or striking first. The first thing he learns is visualization, listening, mm-hmm. sensitivity. And it's like, wow, if Johnny had those skills, maybe he would have a chance at like having a productive conversation with Allie, because he would listen to her telling him no, and he would exercise patience. He would visualize a new path. He would understand maybe what she needs. And instead, he's just so focused on what he wants that he's willing to barrel through and use violence to try and get there. But it just doesn't, that's not how humans respond. Like he's not gonna have a new relationship with a person who has had a problem with him. He's just gonna create fear amongst others and self-resentment. You know, spoiler alert, when we get to Cobra Kai, the show, and mm-hmm. we see an adult Johnny Lawrence, like we see the products of that. Like he's a pretty sad, washed up, out of touch older dude that used to have some skills, but now he's just an alcoholic and lives by himself.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately it's sort of lucky for Johnny Lawrence that that's as bad as it got for him. He's lucky that he just sort of ends up lonely and not like in prison.
Right.
Because, I mean, there are scenes in this movie where, like, they fully, using, like, motor vehicles, drive Daniel off the road and down a hill. Like, he just so easily could have died.
Yeah. That's why we have a Cobra Kai show, mm-hmm. because he was shown that, and it's always sort of haunted him as, like, God, why could it be that? What, like, is that... Nah, it's got to be BS, right? That LaRusso kid, full of crap.
Yeah.
Like...
It's very sad that, like, he doesn't get to have the equivalent of the conversation that Daniel and Allie have about the radio.
Yeah, no one gets to tell Johnny, like, hey, maybe your teacher shouldn't hit you. Maybe, like, your, you know, dad isn't a good guy. Maybe these people that you've been modeling yourself after, maybe that's not going to get you exactly where you think it will.
Yeah.
Maybe everything you think is cool is actually, like, really stupid.
Granted, he has, like, a much harder path out than Allie does, because Allie is sort of aware that she's being mistreated and just needs permission to not let herself be mistreated anymore, whereas he has to deal with that sort of cognitive dissonance of thinking of yourself as a bad person. He has people in his social circle who are like, you're about to kill that kid, you need to stop.
Yeah.
But he also has plenty of people who are like, here, Johnny, dance with our daughter and,
right.
you know, feel free to assault her in public. And if she reacts badly, we'll come and comfort you. So, you know,
and we'll give her a stern talking to. She really should behave better, like a lady at a country club.
Yeah, exactly. Like he is used to having that sort of cover that protects him psychically from having to think of himself as a bad person.
Well, and I like to think that's kind of why we do this show, is for mm-hmm. the Johnny Lawrences of the world, because, like, you know, people don't want to hear this, but it's often tough to be in a privileged position because you're frequently in echo chambers where bad behaviors are reinforced. You know, it's also easy to see these, you know, bright blue-eyed, blonde-headed Aryan boys as you know, like
especially the rich ones.
Yeah, they're rich and they're beautiful and like we just want to see them as true villains, but it's like no, they really didn't even have a chance. Like they've been told that these awful things that they're doing are virtuous by people who are, by most metrics, successful and beautiful and upstanding members of the community. So, like, why would they ever have cause to believe that there might be a different path for them? That, in fact, they are villainous in the ways that other people see them.
Yeah, no one is born acting like Johnny Lawrence. That is a learned pattern of behavior, and he got it from somewhere. He didn't just spring out of his own brain. And I'm guessing he was already enculturated into it before he ever got to Cobra Kai.
Oh, yeah.
There's just no chance that he's not. That's why that country club scene is in there, to be like, he just genuinely doesn't know that he's doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
He's being told that this is what he is supposed to do.
Yeah.
You're supposed to chase after the girl. That's what you do as a man. And if she says no, that means you're not trying hard enough.
Right.
I mean, I think that is, if I had to guess, a mentality that, you know, we talked about those like fascist fight club sort of gyms that cultivate this macho attitude. Like, one of the things that they trade on is misogyny.
Yeah.
That's one of the things they do to get people in the door, is just like, we will teach you how to strong arm the women in your life to giving you what you want. And they don't put that on the posters, obviously, but
they kind of do.
Sometimes they do.
I mean, we know that the like rising incel population is frequently targeted to be a part of these fascist fight club groups because they have this angst of nobody wants me. I'm not desirable in current Gen Z slang. I'm a beta, you know. I mean, for real, like the freaking...
That might even be outdated Gen Z slang. I don't know at this point. They've taken the whole Greek alphabet and they're like, every boy is a different letter.
I just found out that Sigma apparently is like a Sasuke. We've been watching Naruto. Apparently, Sigma means that you're like a lone wolf, but you are popular, but like you don't fit in with the others.
You don't even care about being popular.
Yeah, you don't even care.
You care about bloody revenge.
Yeah, so like...
But don't be a Sasuke either, guys. This is not this conversation, but don't be a Sasuke.
In outdated Gen Z slang, then, like, betas are targeted, and they're made to feel like there's something wrong with them, and if they could only improve their masculinity, air quotes, whatever that means, by getting physically stronger and learning how to take no guff from a woman, that they could become an alpha. And, like, one way to become an alpha is to come train in our MMA gym where we practice beating up people of color and like queers and all. Like, I don't know, man. Like, it's really gross. This is the John Kreese pedagogy. It's like, no, you're all weaklings, you're losers, but I can make you strong. I can make you winners.
It feels like the male-focused equivalent of like the wellness space that is so targeted at women, where it's like, if you just eat these 6 powders and apply these creams to your face, people will love you.
Yeah.
And that the fallacy that these places sell to men is the point of martial arts training is to make you big and strong and beefy and powerful so that women will respect you and want to date you and, I don't know, your dad will love you or whatever, when it's just like, that is not a tenet of martial arts.
No.
I'm sorry. It simply isn't.
And this is what we mean when we talk about reactionary martial arts training. It either is like, okay, you're afraid that there are these sketchy people in the neighborhood that might try to rob or steal from you, and they usually look different from you. Yeah, they're trying to take your job, or they're doing something else nefarious.
They're gonna come date your daughter.
Yeah, they're speaking a different language or something. So like, there's that. Like, you have to be strong enough to defend yourself against threats, foreign and domestic, but mostly foreign.
Yeah.
Or it means like, okay, you're reacting to the fact that you are not being received well in the communities, in the spaces that you want, usually, like, oh, women don't love me or this, but if you just take our magic pill of this martial arts training combined with a lot of like force-fed ideology, then you'll be the successful winner that you want. Women will be crawling all over you, and those foreigners will leave you and your kids alone.
Yeah.
They might even move out of the country altogether.
Yeah. The stereotype about incels, right, is like, if I say the word incel to you, you picture a particular type of guy.
Sure.
That guy does not exist. I appreciate a character like Johnny Lawrence because he's rich and he's good looking and he's blonde and he has everything in the world going for him. And he is the person who is supposedly supposed to have all these women. He's very assertive. Mm-hmm. He certainly goes for what he wants.
Right.
And, Daniel, by comparison, should not ever have anyone's attention. Daniel should be the incel, right? He's the guy who's coming in from outside. He's smaller physically. He has less money. On paper, he should have less going for him. But this movie says right away that, like, the reason that the girl likes him is because he affirms her autonomy. Mm-hmm. And that is the thing above all else that people want. When we talk about, that sort of ineffable thing that people respond well to, it's like, yeah, he's as non-threatening as possible. Not because he couldn't hurt her, he could, obviously, but he looks at her and says, if you want to come and spend time with me, that's great. Your life is your own to do what you want with. Your body is your own. Your possessions are your own. And that is his mentality from the jump. It's not something that he has to be taught.
One thing that these like reactionary martial arts spaces really pick up on is body shaming, like you were talking about, like all the products aimed at women. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, if you're fat, if you have some kind of like birthmark or physical deformity of some type, like whatever, like we're going to absolutely target you because you think that that's the thing. That's the one thing that like if you could change, that it would make your life different. And it's like, no. That's not it. That's not true. And so we see a whole mix of kids that, come from different gender and physique backgrounds and are grappling with different things in the Cobra Kai show.
Well, let's talk briefly about Cobra Kai. We are not going to talk through the whole entire show. We simply do not have the time. But
I'm not caught up because Netflix is doing this nonsense where they're splitting the most recent season into 3 parts or something. So I'm kind of waiting.
Truly indefensible when you have a season that's like 8 episodes long to split it up into multiple parts.
I know. Whatever.
Anyway.
It's all a cash grab.
Yeah, of course it is. But I will talk through a sort of basic synopsis of season 1, just because we have talked a little bit about Johnny's downfall. And I do want to talk a little bit about how the TV show imagines him ending up as an adult as a result of this cocktail of horrible stuff that he is raised to believe as a kid. So this article is from publicbooks.org. It is called Masculinity on the Mat by Vincent Haddad. And it gives us a pretty good rundown of season 1 of Cobra Kai. So, Cobra Kai opens with the Karate Kid's closing sequence. At the 1984 All-Valley Under-18 Karate Championship, Johnny follows the guidance of his unscrupulous sensei and sweeps Daniel's previously injured leg as his absurd sidekick famously shouts, "Get him in a body bag." Daniel then heroically defeats his serial bully with Mr. Miyagi's one-legged crane kick. From this memorable flashback, Cobra Kai makes a tidy and symbolic transition to the present day, cutting from Johnny writhing face down on the tournament mat to Johnny, now middle-aged and hungover, lying face down in his bed wearing loose boxers. Why do they have to be loose, Johnny? Now, over 30 years later, we're finally going to see Johnny's version of events. Johnny, we soon learn, is a victim too. As episode 1 unfolds, the audience is quickly conditioned to link Johnny's nostalgia for the past, as well as his dated cultural and social values, to his abandonment by the economy. Desperate for money, Johnny begrudgingly reopens the Cobra Kai dojo. There, he attracts not only the attention of Daniel, renewing their rivalry, but also a clientele of the very dorks he once terrorized. By re-presenting spliced clips from the original film, the show primes its audience to develop a more complicated, even sympathetic relationship with Johnny's previously flat character.
Yet Cobra Kai uses this generic conceit to construct a compelling critique of generational politics and toxic masculinity. As Johnny sees it, he's going to give his students' pussy generation what it desperately needs. Does he say pussy generation?
Yeah, all the time.
Oh, come on, Johnny. However, unlike the original film, Cobra Kai doesn't limit the viewer to the perspective of a solitary protagonist. After its first episode, the show's camera roves, casting a sympathetic lens on a diverse cast of young characters whom Johnny and Daniel alike repeatedly frame as weak, entitled, and oversensitive. Leading this cast is Miguel Diaz, a socially awkward Ecuadorian-American teenager who lives across the hall from Johnny in a rundown apartment complex in Reseda. He ends up in Reseda.
Yep.
Oh, no, bummer. And seeks Johnny's guidance to defeat a new crop of bullies. Through Johnny, Miguel confronts the absurd yet dangerous bigotry of an older generation. At first, the show treats Johnny's ignorance as a humorous anachronism, on par with listening to hair bands from the 80s, and Miguel gently chides Johnny for his Neanderthal views about race, gender, and sexuality. At one point, Miguel achieves a short-lived success when he convinces Johnny that bigotry is unprofitable, and that marginalized young people are his best chance for students. Johnny's first walk-in is Aisha, an African-American student who is ridiculed at school and online for her weight. Johnny's misogynistic impulse to body shame her and assert that women aren't meant to fight, they have tiny hollow bones, provokes a laugh from viewers, not only because Aisha quickly and predictably dispatches Miguel in a friendly spar, but also for its apparent ignorance of the Karate Kid franchise. If you grew up in the 90s like me, Hilary Swank is the Karate Kid. This joke also exposes how gender lies at the root of Johnny's anger and insecurity. Indeed, gender undergirds most of the jokes about weakness that the audience is meant to find funny in the show's early episodes. Through Johnny and Miguel's humorous repartee on social issues and masculinity, the show successfully lulls viewers into the generic expectation that sensei and student are successfully training each other, just as each generation should be learning from the other. In a heartfelt and all too predictable scene, Johnny is able to convince the All Valley Tournament Committee to lift the lifetime ban on Cobra Kai because of all the ways his dork students have changed him. The audience might respond, yes, kids these days do need to toughen up, and sure, maybe Gen Xers and baby boomers could be a little bit more open-minded. But the show smartly unsettles this generic setup. While Miguel's influence inarguably makes Johnny better, Johnny's influence temporarily improves Miguel's social situation, but ultimately makes him a worse person. So without going too deep into the full Cobra Kai lore, how does Johnny sort of evolve from there?
It's really slow, and it is back and forth. I mean, you kind of nailed it in that synopsis. Like, he's stuck listening to his 80s hair bands, and, like, the only things that he thinks are cool are things that he thought were cool in high school. Like, it's almost like he's woken up out of a time capsule.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's really sad. The good thing is we do see him consistently grow because he actually does develop a caring relationship for a student. And that right there is what separates Johnny from John Kreese. Like, Johnny has the capacity and the potential to develop emotional ties to people that he's training with, younger people, even the ones that he thinks are dorks. Like, he eventually is just like, no, but that's my dork, you know?
Yeah.
It's these bonds, it's these ties of love that help Johnny see that if he actually wants to develop a community, if he doesn't want to just be an alone loser for his whole life, then he needs to respond and be sensitive to the people around him that are telling him the same things. Like, you gotta change. Update with the times, old man. And so, like, that part's great because it eventually sets him up to confront John Kreese and the Cobra Kai ideology and realize that, like, maybe he shouldn't bring it back the way that it was. Maybe it's up to him to take the good parts of Cobra Kai, right? I mean, they were, at least some of it was good for him, maybe. Like, in terms of, like, he sure did learn karate real good, but, like, update that and make it applicable to what his students are facing today and what would help them. That's all well and good, but we still see Johnny, like, being really slow to let go of a lot of toxic masculine traits. Like, when pressed into conflict, he thinks the answer is to fight most of the time. When rejected, he becomes dejected and sort of like crawls back into his shell because it's like, well, no, it's just easier to be alone and to not get hurt than it is to, try and fail. Yeah. He's someone who, like, for all that he, makes fun of these oversensitive dorks, he's oversensitive. Like, yeah, because he hasn't developed a toughness for failing. He's not accustomed to, coming back from failure. Because why would he be? That's part of being rich and privileged and can do no wrong.
Beyond class, I think what leads to a lot of frustration, and not just in men, to be clear, but I think what leads people to that sort of like, well, everyone is out to get me and everyone hates me and like there's it's not even worth trying, is a lack of experience with trying. Mm-hmm. Like, the best advice in the world is just like, try the thing. If you want to talk to a girl, you're gonna have to go and talk to her.
Right.
If you want to like get a job, you have to apply for it. If you have never had to work at anything before, you don't build up that sort of resilience to failure. Or if you just you choose to protect yourself, however way you go about protecting yourself, then of course you're going to get this sort of bitter, like, no one will ever love me and everyone's out to get me sort of attitude, because you have no actual data to work from. Mm-hmm. You have never had to have a conversation where they're like, well, this is what's working and this is what's not, and let's try to figure this out, because you haven't even attempted to form that kind of relationship in the first place. What lessons do you think that viewers can take away from Johnny, either as depicted in Karate Kid or throughout his arc in Cobra Kai, at least to the extent that you have seen it? What are some concrete lessons we can take away from him?
I mean, freaking go to therapy.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes it's really important to have a person that you don't know hear about your life and tell you, like, hey, that's pretty messed up, actually. Like, yeah. Have you thought about the fact that maybe your dad just totally ignoring you set some, like, unrealistic expectation for you to achieve greatness, to seek out praise from someone who's never going to give it to you, and then when that didn't happen, you found a substitute role model who ended up being a violent psychopath that you were trying to please by becoming a violent psychopath? Like, yeah. Maybe there's a different way. And maybe, did you ever think about the fact that all of your friends, air quotes, were also similarly brainwashed? And so every time you sought a moral compass in someone else, it was someone who was experiencing the same problems as you. Maybe this thing that you're so frustrated by, this outsider, this Daniel LaRusso type, or the fact that you can't connect with Allie or any of these other people, maybe that's part of the thing you should be exploring. Like, what is it that is inhibiting you from developing these connections with people who are different from you? Let's talk about that. I mean, that's the advice. It's like, yeah, Johnny should be the illustration of how easy it is to be born into, enculturated by, and then locked into these communities that are echo chambers that not only make you think that your behavior is normal and maybe even virtuous or good, but keep you from questioning how they might be limited or how you might seek something else.
I like what the synopsis said about teachers and students changing each other, especially if they've chosen to portray adult Johnny as someone who is stuck in a moment of his life, mm-hmm. like sort of the last moment he remembered things feeling like they were going right, mm-hmm. and just staying there forever despite the fact that it's very clearly not working.
Right.
I do think part of it is just like, go find a different perspective, mm-hmm. somewhere. Like, go talk to someone who was raised in a different environment than you. Go to a different part of the world, or a different part of your own country, or across the tracks to Reseda, and see some other way of thinking about the world. In a very simplistic way, like, that's what worked for Allie, is she was just like curious enough about a point of view that was different from hers that she was like, yeah, I'll go talk to this guy who's like not the nice blonde rich boy that my parents want me to date, and I'll see what he has to say about the world. Maybe I won't like it, maybe I will. And it turns out that the thing that he had to say is like, you're allowed to stand up for yourself.
And the reason that author calls the the narrative predictable is because we already talked about, like, that's what happened to Daniel and Miyagi. Miyagi, very different story, but he was also locked into one very particular part of his past and was unwilling to sort of move forward until he had young student Daniel challenge him to think, why are you stuck here? Why are you only doing this? Why are you such a hermit? You know, like, and so slowly through the advice that Miyagi was giving Daniel, he had to sort of like parse through it himself and realize, like, oh man, maybe it's not good that I just am totally alone all the time, and celebrate these very sad anniversaries and live in the past only. Seek out difference. Learn from it. Be receptive to new ideas and new perspectives. Embrace nuance.
Yeah. Well, and especially if you are in the United States, where we know so many of our educational systems are designed to feed us a very specific narrative about the world and our place in it, and make us incurious about experiences that are different from our own. And it is sort of painful to realize you've been raised that way. I'm not going to say that it doesn't suck to realize you've been misled your whole life, and not through anyone's intentional misleading, just because we've all been indoctrinated that way. But it is very important to be a well-rounded person to look for some perspectives other than your own.
Yeah, it's not easy, is what I'll tell you.
Well, and there's the psychic hurdle of not having realized you were doing anything harmful until it was pointed out to you, and being like, I've been doing that my whole life. And nobody said anything until now. Like, how much damage have I done without even realizing I was doing it?
Right.
And that sucks, because none of us want to think of ourselves as harmful people.
But yeah, I mean, sometimes just by the very nature of existing and not doing something, you're also doing harm. Like, sometimes just living your life and doing nothing to the contrary is harmful. And like, you can't wallow in the shame or guilt of that, like we see Johnny do in Cobra Kai. Instead, it's like, okay, you've had enough time to process the fact that you were part of the bad team. Like, so now what? How do you move forward? What do you do that's going to break that cycle? And he doesn't. He fucks up Miguel.
Yeah.
Unintentionally. There's more seasons, but it's
you
like...
You apologize, and you get up, and you try again.
Yeah.
That's all you can do. Let's talk about the main event. Our main challenger on the card tonight is Mr. Miyagi, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, as we talk about Mr. Miyagi, I do want to start with the problem, the big obvious problem. We have a quote here from, I was going to say friend of the show, but I guess not friend of the show. Friend of you.
Friend of me.
Friend of you, an academic named Paul Bowman, discusses in an article for The Conversation, the Karate Kid has a big looming problem over it. It's Spencer, if you would read that quote for us.
Sure. Paul says, coming a decade after the Kung Fu craze of the 1970s, the Karate Kid translates Hong Kong Kung Fu into Hollywood karate. It registers the popularity and power of a macho, militarized karate. Cobra Kai's bad guy sensei, John Kreese, Martin Krove, was a Green Beret soldier. Against this, the film advocates the quote-unquote exotic idea of a pacifist and cultured karate, one based on balance and harmony. Yet, the idea that, quote, true karate is pacifist and philosophical owes considerably more to hippie counterculture and the 1970s TV series Kung Fu than it does to anything actually Eastern. Indeed, The Karate Kid is arguably a vital part of the, quote, spiritualizing and, quote, existentializing of Asian martial arts that took place in Western popular culture in the early 1980s. Asian martial arts are not just about macho pugilism. They are paths to development, self-improvement, and, quote-unquote, peace. This is expressed through Orientalist imagery and straightforward binaries, opposing the heartless, macho, militarized modern, quote, West, with a sensitive, nurturing, philosophical, and ancient, quote, East. The problem is that this is the very hallmark of Orientalism, the simplistic, reductive stereotyping of the, quote, mysterious East. Orientalism is not quite racism, but it's not a world away either. Certainly, Merida had to fulfill a certain stereotype. We know this because he auditioned twice for the Mr. Miyagi role. The first time, he spoke in his own voice with an American accent. He bombed. So, he returned with a thick Japanese accent and sentence constructions worthy of Charlie Chan, the fictional 1930s film detective long criticized for perpetuating stereotypes of Asian characters. This time, Merida aced it, because he now conformed to what scholar Jane Irimura calls the Oriental monk stereotype.
So, if you didn't know, that is not how Pat Morita sounds. Pat Morita has a pretty straight over the plate American accent, but he was required by the constraints of 1980s Hollywood to put on an accent, and I don't know to what extent the sentence construction is part of the script or if that's a thing that he did all on his own, but certainly one of the most iconic things about this movie is the way that he speaks. If you have heard someone quote this movie, what is the thing that you have heard them quote?
Wax on, wax off.
Certainly, Asian and Asian American audiences have understandably mixed feelings about this movie and Merida's performance in it. Not in the least because of, as, you just heard Spencer do, white audience members kind of latched on to the lowest hanging fruit of this movie, which is the accent and the syntax, and just used that as a racist weapon against Asian people that they knew in real life. Odds are, if you have heard someone use the phrase wax on, wax off before, it was meant to mock Asian people, either in real life or in theory, rather than to express any kind of respect for this movie or the depiction of karate and martial arts within it.
Which is wild to me because as now a pretty much lifelong martial artist, there are times when we've been doing racisms and I didn't realize it because there's just enough martial theory in this movie to be applicable sometimes in class. Like when you're trying to teach someone a circular block, you can kind of just assume that people have seen Karate Kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so you use this as a teaching tool. You're like, no, you're doing it this way. Instead think wax on, wax off, it's oh, we took what was not quote unquote real karate and have used it in martial arts spaces, but to the detriment of just not acknowledging the sort of Orientalist nature of the entire enterprise. So it's wild to me because I've sort of quoted this movie just a million times, but usually in a martial arts teaching context.
Well, and I think that's kind of the problem when something gets as popular as the Karate Kid. With each new audience that gets brought in, you lose a little bit more of that contextual understanding. I mean, if only martial artists had ever watched this movie, that might be one thing, but what gets taken up by the larger culture is not, a sophisticated conversation about balance and nonviolence. It's wax on, wax off,
right,
because that's quotable. And it gets to the part where that's just part of a vernacular way of talking about Asian people, especially by people who haven't seen the movie. There are plenty of people who haven't seen this movie, but have heard the phrase wax on, wax off said in a fake Japanese accent before.
Yeah.
And that is what ends up being the sort of staying power.
And to the same point, even though it's good advice that I'm circulating from this franchise, because of those broken sentence construction of it, it's memorable. And I tell my students that all the time, even if I don't say it in the fake accent, even just repeating a way that I don't speak is in some way, I don't know. It's tough because I think about this too, because I've had Asian instructors that particularly perform this Oriental monk stereotype in class because we'll give commands in Korean or whatever. And so when I say those commands or those words, and I'm not the only one, I'm imitating the people that I learned from. And so it's okay, am I perpetuating a stereotype? Am I actually doing a disservice and sort of mocking them by doing this? Am I honoring them? It changes the ethos a bit because it's I'm invoking this idea of what Paul is calling the sort of spiritualized, philosophical, true karate or something, and exoticizing it in a way, instead of just saying like, hey, actually, like, if you block, you can hurt yourself. Why don't you move instead? You know? And in a teaching perspective, it's like, well, because unfortunately, when students take martial arts, especially East Asian martial arts classes, they're sort of half expecting some mysticism, like because of what they've come to believe through films like Karate Kid. Like they're expecting me to have these like kernels of wisdom and little fortune cookie advices that go with all these lessons and stuff. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah, this is the tricky part of this kind of cultural exchange, right? It's like, which part of this product do I, as the receiver of this knowledge, keep? Like, what part of it is essential to the experience, and what part of it is me doing an imitation of a culture that I am not a part of?
Right.
And I don't have a super good answer for that.
I don't either, because, like, I know that when I'm imitating people, real life or characters, it's from a place of love and admiration, but even that is orientalizing. That's like, you know, being attracted to the quote unquote exotic other.
Yeah.
And it's a problem, not because it's inherently bad, but what it does is take away from the reality of the person or the thing or the practice.
Yeah.
That is in its own way dehumanizing. And I think that's what you're about to share a quote with us that sort of gets at that perspective.
Yeah, I think a big part of the moral is that you don't know how your audience is going to receive that and what lesson they are going to take away. So this quote that I'm about to read is from Medium, and it is by a Chinese-American author who, at least on Medium, just goes by John. I don't know what his full name is, but
Johnny Lawrence.
It's not Johnny Lawrence. I know that for a fact. But he describes growing up in the 90s in sort of the Metro Detroit area, and how groups of white people would mock him and his father, specifically as they're waiting in line at their favorite ice cream shop, which is... That's not a worse place to be, like, harassed and discriminated against, but it is, like, it's so galling. They just wanted to get some ice cream.
I mean, don't ruin ice cream for the boy,
come
you know?
on. So here's a quote from that article. It seemed like everyone in the Metro Detroit area wanted to tell my family how much my dad looked like Mr. Miyagi. I started to loathe groups of white teenage boys because I knew it was only a matter of time before they would say, just loudly enough for my dad to hear, "Wax on, Daniel-san," or simply mocked our language. My dad never ignored them. He would confront them and, if nearby, their parents, challenging them to say it louder, to say it to his face. Almost always, the teenagers would recoil and protest that he should be able to take a joke. The confrontations in public would leave everyone around uncomfortably silent, staring as my dad demanded an apology. The Mr. Miyagi comparisons never stopped. To this day it happens, and to this day I seethe with an anger that I can barely control. I hated that people would remark with surprise that my dad didn't have an accent, despite their knowledge that he was born on the east side of Detroit. My dad told me that Pat Morita didn't really have an accent either, that he was simply playing a character in the movie, which incensed me. Why didn't he just speak the way he normally spoke? Why did he take this role? How could he not realize that white America would just see other Asian men and conflate the character with them? Was he aware that he's the reason people felt comfortable adopting racist accents in order to mock us? I stopped watching The Karate Kid. I shoved the bandana my parents bought me deep into a drawer and loudly proclaimed that I hated the movie. In high school and college, I would talk about how it was the equivalent of yellowface, that he set back Asian Americans by taking that role, that I understood why he took the role, money, but I wished he hadn't. And John goes on to explain that he eventually revisited The Karate Kid as an adult and sort of made his peace with the character of Mr. Miyagi and Pat Morita as an actor. But I think this probably is not a terribly uncommon experience. And I think as time goes on and this movie gets older and older, and fewer people have seen the actual movie, like maybe they've watched Cobra Kai, or maybe they just like have the sort of cultural knowledge because it is such a phenomenon in the culture. Unfortunately, like what a lot of people have left is this just sort of distilled racist stereotype, and they don't know any of the context or any of the actual story of the movie, and so it's just the bad with none of the good. And I think it's understandable that people who are on the receiving end of racist harassment would really resent this movie. What he says in the article is basically like, this movie did not invent these stereotypes. Pat Morita certainly did not invent these stereotypes. This was an existing problem in Hollywood long, long, long before The Karate Kid was made. It's sort of built into some of the earliest movies we have, is just some pretty god-awful Asian stereotypes and racist tropes and stuff.
It was like disgusting, effeminizing, like Asian males were just the butt of the joke, like, and only talked in this broken English, weird sort of nonsense. We get to a point where there can be the Pat Moritas of the world. Yes, it's awful and terrible that he got rejected from his first audition when he wasn't speaking in an accent. This is a problem of Hollywood. This is a problem of people needing to make money from a film, realizing what their audiences still expected. That said, at the very least, what Pat Morita brought to this performance is a real study of a real person. Yeah, tropes and stereotypes included, but Mr. Miyagi, and there's a great documentary about this, the real Mr. Miyagi is inspired by a real person, Sensei Fumio Demura, someone who Pat Morita became very close with before the filming and the development of the Karate Kid series. So, like, Pat Morita is at the very least trying to accurately represent a Japanese-American immigrant who is a karate teacher in an urban Western American environment.
Not that this is an excuse, again, but if you compare Mr. Miyagi to his contemporaries in the film scene at the time, like, the other one is Long Duck Dong. Again, super low bar that we're clearing here, and the point is not necessarily, like, is the character defensible or not? If people are using quotes from this movie to harass people, then obviously that is unacceptable, and it is at least as much the audience's fault as it is the actual movie's fault.
Right.
Like, it certainly isn't fair to place a blame on Pat Morita, but it is absolutely fair to resent a cultural phenomenon that leads your father to being harassed when he's just trying to eat ice cream.
Sure.
You know?
Well, and we're also not taking the stance, like, we're not even really entertaining the question, is this or is it not an example of Orientalism? Of course it is. Yeah, it absolutely is. But also there are unexpected things about Miyagi's character, like being a soldier in the American Army during World War II. On the one hand, this movie could encourage people to learn a little bit more about history and people in ways that Mickey Rooney's character in Breakfast at Tiffany's absolutely will not.
Yeah,
you know?
Long Duck Dong is not leading to any kind of education, really. Yeah. As much as Miyagi's characterization is rooted in stereotypes, it is not solely rooted in stereotypes. Neither of us has ever been a soldier, so we can't speak fully to the realism of either of our two soldier characters, either Mr. Miyagi or John Kreese. But certainly we know from historical documentation and understanding that the tragedy at the heart of Mr. Miyagi's character absolutely has a bearing in reality.
Right.
I went down a rabbit hole on this one too, because I was curious about that question Spencer just raised. Like, were there a large number of Japanese American soldiers in World War II? Like, given the situation with internment camps, like how did that sort of recruitment work? What were the attitudes towards that? And I found a National Geographic article by a writer named Aaron Blakemore that kind of breaks down the history of the fairly substantial Japanese American military experience during World War II.
So Blakemore tells us, at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were already about 5,000 Nisei, second-generation Japanese immigrants, in the U.S. Army, most of them in the Hawaii Army National Guard. There, they both witnessed the attack and responded in its immediate aftermath. Japanese-American college students also enlisted in the Hawaii Territorial Guard after the attack, and others showed up at the recruitment offices on the mainland. part of a wave of hundreds of thousands of Americans who volunteered for service in a burst of patriotism. Although they were willing to fight and even die for the U.S., it was assumed that Japanese Americans had split loyalty at best. In Hawaii, the National Guardsmen were stripped of their guns and ammunition, segregated, and assigned tasks like digging trenches or putting up barbed wire. In January 1942, all Nisei in the Hawaii Territorial Guard were informed that it was being disbanded. They were discharged from their units without an explanation, only to learn the Guard had been reformed the next day without them. A month later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the creation of military areas from which, quote, any or all persons, code for people of Japanese ancestry, might be excluded. This laid the legal foundation to, quote, evacuate about 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes and forcibly incarcerate them.
So the Nisei people were all classified as 4C. So if you remember back in It's a Wonderful Life, where Mr. Potter
1A.
is saying 1A, that means you're being sent to active combat. 4C means that you are ineligible to serve in the armed forces because of your race or ancestry.
Jeez.
What a cool rule to have. Awesome. Despite that, there was still this push, particularly in Hawaii, by Japanese American students. And some of the University of Hawaii ROTC members petitioned the governor to be allowed to do something. Like, okay, if we can't be in, active duty or whatever, like, let us do something. So he did allow them to form a sort of like volunteer group that did things like digging ditches and building barracks, etc. But, it was a pretty bad war, particularly on the Pacific Front. And so I will continue this quote from the National Geographic article. But their fate changed when the military got wind that Japan's navy was headed towards Midway Atoll near the Hawaiian Islands in May 1942. Concerned about whether Nisei could be trusted should Japan invade Hawaii, the U.S. Army secretly shipped all 1,432 of them to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. As the government waffled on what to do with the newly named 100th Infantry Battalion, in parentheses, separate, the soldiers, most of whom had not even been able to say goodbye to their loved ones before being shipped out, underwent basic training. Then sentiment began to shift. The men's exemplary discipline and performances during basic training helped resolve the now furious debate over whether to allow Japanese Americans to serve in combat. So, ironically, did Japanese propaganda, pointing to America's racism. Embarrassed by the enemy's finger-pointing and impressed by the Nisei soldiers, in February 1943, the military created the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese unit. More than 10,000 Nisei men volunteered from Hawaii and another 2,300 from internment camps. In summer 1943, the 100th headed to North Africa, where they were assigned to guard German POWs instead of engaging in battle. But the battalion's commanding officer lobbied to join active combat, and the 100th ended up participating in the Allied push through Italy. There, it became known as the Purple Heart Battalion for the tremendous casualties its members suffered. The 100th shrank by over half before it was absorbed into the 442nd, which arrived in Europe in May 1944. Another 6,000 Nisei men were recruited straight from the camps to serve as military linguists, and thousands of others were called up when the draft was reinstated for Japanese American men in early 1944. Not everyone was willing to go. Men in some camps staged protests, and more than 300, known as no-no boys, were jailed for their refusal to serve. But others went into battle, even as the U.S. continued to incarcerate their families. Those Nisei who did serve, writes historian James C. McNaughton, did so not blindly or automatically, but in full knowledge that their country had not given their parents a fair shake. The 442nd would become the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, earning more than 18,000 individual awards. The unit's motto, Go for Broke, represented its members' drive to prove themselves to the country that had tried to keep them from fighting. About 800 of the 33,000 Japanese Americans who served in World War II died in combat. In 2011, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to those who served in the 100th, the 442nd, and the Military Intelligence Service during World War II.
Yeah, it's wild to me to hear stories like this of people risking their lives and leaving their families and quote unquote going for broke
Yeah.
when they're ultimately protecting a country that doesn't protect them.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to Miyagi, having this what could very well just be melodrama scene of him, you know, reliving the news that he received when he was, you know, fighting against the Germans, that his wife and future son died in childbirth in an internment camp. It's like, wow, that's wild. That couldn't really be true, could it? And it's like, yeah, actually, that likely did happen to many people. I remember watching this when I was 7 years old and being so confused by that scene, but in a way that was unsettling to me as a child. It really does strike some important chords, and this is one of them.
That scene is so shocking because up to that point, we've gotten used to a certain level of stakes. Like, the stakes are high for Daniel, right? Like, people have, like, really tried to do him some real physical damage, and he is trying to learn how to defend himself, and that feels, like, pretty serious. But this scene, like, introduces a whole new sort of dimension of stakes. It's not just like, how do we understand this character? It's like, well, we thought he was just kind of like a weird old hermit, but now we understand that he is like cloistered in grief.
Right.
But it also introduces this new understanding of violence and fighting and the role that it serves in the world, where like Daniel is thinking of combat as a way to like prove himself. You know, maybe Miyagi is one of those people who, when he went to war, that's what he was thinking too, is like, I will do this sort of stereotypically masculine, violent thing. I will go to war to defend the country that I live in, even though that country doesn't like me. And if I do a good enough job, I will earn their respect, only to just have the worst thing in the world happen.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gives us a larger context to see this movie as not just like some kids getting into or trying to avoid schoolyard bullying. It's not. Like, what we're seeing is a future generation of people who would fight, kill, or die in a world conflict like World War II. And they're being taught by these people with incredible trauma from such violence. It's up to our young heroes, you know, the Daniels and the Johnnies of the world, to figure out a way to break those cycles.
It's interesting to think about this question of enemies, right? Like the sort of evil at the heart of the Cobra Kai philosophy is not even the strike hard part. It's look for enemies and grant them no mercy.
Right.
Throughout the movie, we see Daniel being treated as an enemy in these sort of shallow, like high school ways. Like, you're talking to my girlfriend and now you're my enemy. It's interesting that the article talks about one of the things that encouraged the United States government to allow Japanese Americans into the army is people pointing at them and saying, like, look at how racist that country is. How can they possibly be the good guys? Look at what they're doing.
Right.
And so we know that Miyagi also knows what it is like to be treated as an enemy.
Right.
And it doesn't lead to, like, a fair fight. It leads to, like, babies dying.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, not in defense of John Kreese, really, but his backstory that we get more of in Cobra Kai is that he was a prisoner of war. He understands what it feels like to be an enemy as well. He understands what it feels like to be shown no mercy. And that's a very real lived experience as well. So I totally understand why he would come back thinking, I must prepare these soft peacetime children for the inevitable fact that someone will show them no mercy. And if they want to avoid it, they have to do that first. They have to strike first.
Yeah. It's two very different ways of dealing with the same source of trauma, which is a world conflict driven by racist misunderstandings and, you know, ultimately fights for resources and things like that. But the enemy in Vietnam looked an awful lot like at least some of the enemies in World War II from the American perspective. Just because John Kreese is a white guy doesn't mean that conflict didn't hurt him profoundly. Like, when world forces go to war over racist ideals, it just hurts everyone.
Yeah.
It hurts you if you're the people who stay home. It hurts you if you're the poster boy for the all-American way. You're the nice white soldier. you're still gonna get hurt. We're just going back to this idea that war is a zero-sum game. It just, no one wins.
Yeah. And in terms of like, what's the takeaway from this movie? That's a pretty good one.
Mm-hmm.
We get to see the idea of conflict and fighting on scales large and small, stakes, little and big. And at the end of all of it, the message of fighting should be the last resort really does ring true, because when you fight, everyone loses. The sword cuts both ways. If you are forced to use it, you're also hurting yourself.
There's nothing wrong necessarily with having a culture of sort of playful combat, right? Like, when you place rules around things, it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody gets hurt. At that first scene, Johnny kicks Daniel, Daniel hits him, and he says something along the lines of like, okay, we're even now. Like, can we be done?
Right.
And it's this toxic idea of like having to fight till the other guy is dead.
Right.
That
you're done when I say you're done.
Yeah, that gets Johnny into trouble.
Oh, boy.
But that could have been like, all right, we both did our thing. Can we just talk now? Like, if Johnny actually wanted to talk, as he said he did when he first showed up, then we could have maybe moved forward.
Well, it's interesting. I think about that scene in the bathroom at the Halloween party where Daniel forces karma to happen, basically. Like,
yeah.
It multiple points in this movie, we see Johnny and Daniel misunderstand ideology and what their teachers are trying to teach them.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, Johnny thinks strike first, strike hard, no mercy applies to enemies that are really just like people that you might be having a disagreement with. That's not an enemy.
Everyone becomes an enemy as opposed to a person I'm mildly annoyed by.
And Daniel becomes, just familiar enough with concepts and philosophies that he doesn't understand to think that karma is something that you have a hand in, that you are like an active agent of, and that it's coming back around because of something I did. No, idiot.
Well, and specifically because of a hurtful thing I did.
Right.
Like, it's okay for me to do hurtful things to people who have done hurtful things. That's fair, as opposed to just a perpetuation of people behaving cruelly towards each other.
He might even think that that's this balance thing that Miyagi's been talking about. But it's like, no, dude. Like, that's like the worst version of an eye for an eye, and then the whole world goes blind.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so, I think, like, our catchphrase of embrace nuance is something that we can take away from this movie. We can take away the old adage, war is hell.
Yeah.
I mean, but really?
Always. We always take away war is hell. It just strikes me as such a shame that the takeaway for so many people is Mr. Miyagi talks funny, and not ultimately what Daniel takes away from that interaction, which is what a horrible weight that this person has had to bear because someone labeled him an enemy for no reason.
Right.
And maybe I should be thoughtful about how I think of other people and how I label them in my head.
Right.
And ultimately, Daniel comes around to this idea of, I want to, just as he said to Allie, like, I want to stand up for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to hurt Johnny because I want to hurt Johnny. I want to stand up for myself so that I don't have to live in fear and other people around me don't have to live in fear. That's why I want to fight.
I want to prove to people that I'm not the stereotype they've convinced themselves that I am.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I had to learn by getting to know someone who I only thought of in terms of stereotypes, that he's a full human being with experiences that I can only learn from. And like, I think at the heart of this film, it's important that people do engage with those surface level biases, because that's how we see growth. That's how we see people ultimately avoiding conflict, by taking the time to be sensitive, to learn, and to develop an actual empathy with people that are unlike them.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be Johnny and girls, or whether it be Daniel and Asian people, or whether it be with like this violent ideology that's really easy to misplace on people who are not actual enemies. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot that we can learn from Karate Kid, and I love this movie. I'm never gonna not love this movie.
Yeah, ultimately, I think like the cure for the misunderstandings of the Karate Kid is to watch the Karate Kid.
Yeah.
Especially if you are a person who has maybe been inclined to use a Mr. Miyagi voice to mock someone with no understanding of that character and his context. and the real lived experiences of the real people that character is based on.
Well, and watch the real Mr. Miyagi documentary. That will help as well. And read some of these articles and these books that we're recommending from martial arts studies scholars to help contextualize what is real karate, what's, Hollywood karate, what are these invented traditions that even karate practitioners, buy into in terms of myth, and like, what are the things that we can actually learn and observe about Chinese, Japanese, even some Indian philosophies that are at play in this movie that have been appropriated and boiled down and sort of like two-dimensionalized, but like they're there. And if you know what you're looking for and you know how to critically examine them, you can learn a lot from watching a movie like this.
I don't even remember the first time I watched this movie, but like for a long time, this was the sum total of my understanding of martial arts. And I mean, obviously I've learned much more since meeting you, but like the core moral in my mind has not really changed. The point of martial arts, and by extension the rest of your life, is not to hurt people. I don't think anybody could watch this movie and walk away thinking like, God, it would be really cool to just kick someone in the face until they're dead. The best way to combat stereotypes is to learn about the actual people. So that I would second that, encourage people to seek out real information about the martial arts and the people and the philosophies, and stop harassing people who are just trying to buy ice cream. What is wrong with you people?
It's always good advice.
Let them eat their ice cream.
Let them eat their cream.
That's
all
the
right,
end, baby.
So you're going to slap a rating, crane kick a rating on this bad boy?
Let's crane kick a rating right onto this. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how highly would you recommend The Karate Kid, and to whom?
Oh my gosh. I want to give it a 10 out of 10, but that's just ridiculous. I can't. I'll give it a 9.5 though. I'm super high on this movie. I think anyone can learn from it. I think, this is for all audiences. I mean, I don't have much to say other than just like watch The Karate Kid. I don't know, like different age groups can get different things out of it. The more work you put into it, the more you can get out of it. Talking about like doing a little bit of research for yourself, interacting with real people that have some similar lived experiences can help you better understand a movie like this.
I'm inclined to agree. I think I'm sitting around an 8 or so, just because there is some cheesy 80s-ness that I'm like, oh boy. But all in all, I think if you take the time to actually understand what is being said, it can be a really valuable way to talk about history and these different philosophies, especially if you're like a parent and you're willing to like kind of sit down and have that conversation with a kid, or if you're a teacher or something like that. I think it's a really good tool to talk about this era of history and this group of people that we don't talk about, things that we're kind of kept away from learning too much about. The average history class doesn't want to talk about the internment camps for very long.
No.
They don't want to talk about the reality of what this country did to a group of people who had done nothing wrong and continues to do to this day to different groups of people.
I do think this is required reading for martial artists. Like, that's why my score is so high. Like, if you do martial arts and you haven't seen this movie, well, then you're doing it wrong. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, especially for kids who are starting martial arts, because, like, it is so easy as a youngster to misinterpret some of these like life lessons that are trying to, be shared with you in your martial arts classes, particularly when you start talking about like, when is it okay to fight? When should you fight? Who's protecting what? Like, because the stakes are just like usually not very high for you as a kid, and you probably misinterpret, some small scale bullying as the next World War, and having a little bit of context can help you avoid violence, I think. So if you do martial arts, you gotta watch Karate Kid.
Yeah. Well,
but don't do the accent, okay? Like, that's kind of where we're coming down on.
Just don't do the accent.
Yeah.
Now we can talk about all the other martial arts movies you want to talk about. I made Spencer talk about The Karate Kid first because I was like, that is the through line that everybody in the United States has.
Yeah.
So I think that we're going to call it here.
Let's call it.
If you have any other thoughts about Karate Kid, drop us a line. Let us know. Let us know if there's something we missed, or if you have other recommendations for other movies similar to The Karate Kid that we should talk about next. But until next time, I keep saying until next time as
until
if
next time. This has been Compassionate Crane Kicks Straight to Your Face.
Join us next time for more compassionate conversations about masculinity in media. Bye.
Bonsai!
Bonsai.